It's shortly before 5:45 in the morning on May 16, 1968, in Canning Town, in London's East End. Most of the 260 residents of a new 22-story tower block called Ronan Point are still asleep. The building has been open for 2 months. On the 18th floor, in a corner flat looking out over the Thames, a woman is up early. She fills her kettle, goes to light the gas stove for a cup of tea, and strikes a match. She doesn't know it yet, but gas has been leaking into her kitchen for hours from a stove connection with a fitting that never should have passed inspection. The match ignites the gas. The explosion is not, by the standards of gas explosions, an especially large one. But it does one very specific, very unlucky thing. It blows outward the precast concrete panel that forms part of the flat's external wall. A wall that, in this building's design, isn't just an outer skin. It's load-bearing. It's holding up everything above it. With that wall gone, the 4 flats stacked directly above have nothing left to stand on. They fall. And when a slab dropping from 4 floors up lands on the floor below it, it doesn't stop there. It takes that floor's wall out too, and drops onto the one after that, and the one after that. In a matter of seconds, the entire southeast corner of the building comes down, floor by floor, from the 22nd story to the ground. 4 people die. 17 more are hurt. It could have been far worse. Most residents were still in their bedrooms, away from the kitchens and living rooms that faced the corner that fell. Ronan Point had opened to the public 2 months earlier as a flagship of modern British housing, one of hundreds of tower blocks going up across the country using a fast, cheap, factory-built method of construction. Within hours, its name would become shorthand for exactly the opposite, for what happens when a building has no way to stop a small local failure from taking the whole structure down with it. To understand how a single cracked gas fitting could do that much damage, the story has to start almost 20 years earlier, in the post-war scramble to build housing as fast as Britain possibly could. After the Second World War, Britain has a severe, decades-long housing shortage, made worse by wartime bomb damage across East London. Government policy, across multiple administrations, comes to see height as the answer. The Housing Subsidy Act of 1956 pays local councils a subsidy for new flats that rises with every additional story, so a 6-story block earns more than twice the subsidy of a house, and a much taller block earns even more. Building up, quite literally, pays better than building out. In 1962, Sir Keith Joseph, then Minister of Housing and Local Government, pushes this further, setting a national target of 350,000 new homes a year, and championing industrialized, factory-built construction methods as the only realistic way to hit it. The pressure this creates flows down to individual boroughs, including West Ham, later absorbed into the newly formed London Borough of Newham, where the borough architect, Thomas North, is a committed advocate of building high to meet acute local housing need. For the Freemasons Road estate in Canning Town, North's department selects Taylor Woodrow Anglian as the builder, using a licensed method called the large panel system. It uses precast concrete wall and floor panels, cast off-site and bolted together on-site, needing comparatively little skilled labor. The specific system Taylor Woodrow has licensed, called Larsen-Nielsen, comes from Denmark, where it was developed and proven for buildings up to around 6 stories. Ronan Point, one of the estate's point blocks, is built to 22. Taylor Woodrow also insists that the borough appoint Phillips Consultants as the project's structural engineers. Phillips Consultants is a firm that Taylor Woodrow wholly owns. It's an arrangement that puts the same company on both sides of the table, building the structure and signing off on whether it's sound. No independent check stands between them. On site, the work itself is done under time and cost pressure, much of it by workers recruited locally with limited training in this specific, unforgiving system, often paid by how fast panels go up rather than by how well the joints between them are finished. Those joints matter more than they look like they should. The design relies on each panel being packed with dry-packed mortar and mechanically tied to its neighbors, so that if one panel were ever damaged, the load it carried could find another way down through the structure. A building research station inspection of a similar Taylor Woodrow site in Rugby in 1964 finds multiple defective joints, missing steel loops, missing location bars, and warns that loads meant to pass safely through mortar are instead passing through bolts alone. The warning does not change what happens next. Ronan Point, going up around the same time, gets built anyway. Construction finishes on March 11, 1968. Ronan Point opens. Tenants move in. 2 months later, a fitting on a gas stove on the 18th floor gives way. The inquiry that follows the collapse, chaired by Hugh Griffiths QC, with the structural engineer Professor Sir Alfred Pugsley and the mechanical engineer Professor Sir Owen Saunders, is able to reconstruct, in detail, exactly what happened inside flat 90 that morning, and exactly why it did the damage it did. The immediate cause is mechanical and almost mundane. A brass nut connecting the flexible hose of the flat's gas stove to the supply pipe had been manufactured below specification, its flange too thin, and its chamfer cut too steep, and it fractured under a tightening force a sound nut would have taken. The inquiry found the fitter had acted in accordance with good practice and attached no blame to him. Gas seeped from the crack overnight, filling the sealed kitchen. Shortly before 5:45 in the morning on May 16th, the resident struck a match to light the stove for tea and was knocked unconscious by the blast that followed. She survives. What makes this ordinary domestic accident historic is what the inquiry finds next. The explosion inside that kitchen was not, on its own, powerful enough to explain what happened to the rest of the building. The pressure it generated was well within the range that gas explosions in flats had produced before, elsewhere, without bringing a structure down. What turned a contained kitchen explosion into the collapse of an entire corner of a 22-story tower was the building itself. The blast blew out the precast concrete panel forming the flat's external flank wall. The wall load-bearing walls of this design rely on to carry weight straight down to the ground. With that panel gone, the wall panels and floor slabs of the 4 flats stacked directly above it lost their support and fell. Each falling slab struck the floor below with enough force to blow out that floor's wall panel in turn, repeating the same failure 1 story at a time, all the way down to the ground. The building's own load path, the same simple, unbroken stack of panel on panel that made it fast and cheap to build, is what let 1 broken wall become 22. The Griffiths Tribunal states its central finding plainly. The collapse was inherent in its design, not primarily the result of faulty workmanship. The design had never required panels to be tied together in a way that would let load reroute itself if 1 panel failed. No alternative path, no redundancy, nothing to stop a local failure from becoming a total one. The report recommends that new construction of this kind include exactly that kind of reinforcement and continuity going forward. That finding will not turn out to be the whole story. When Ronan Point is finally, carefully dismantled nearly 2 decades later, engineers find something the 1968 inquiry didn't have the chance to see from the outside. The joints between panels, which were supposed to be packed with dry-pack mortar to transfer load safely between panels, are in places instead packed with tin cans, cigarette packets, and newspaper. Building site rubbish, stuffed in rather than the fill the design called for. Some of that newspaper is dated years after the original construction, meaning even the reinforcement work ordered after the 1968 collapse was, in places, done the same way. The building's fault was never only a drawing board oversight, it was also, all along, badly built. 4 people die in the collapse itself. A 5th resident, seriously injured, dies in hospital some weeks later. Sources differ on whether her death is formally attributed to the disaster. So this script counts the 4 whose deaths are consistently and directly tied to the collapse across the record. 17 others are treated in hospital. The death toll would very likely have been far higher had the explosion happened in the evening, when residents would have been in their living rooms rather than asleep in bedrooms further from the corner that came down. No one lit that match on purpose, and no one who worked on Ronan Point set out to build something that could collapse like this. What the inquiry and later investigation lay out instead is a chain of decisions, political, commercial, and professional, that each made sense on their own terms, and combined into a building with no margin for error. Politically, the pressure traces back to Sir Keith Joseph's 1962 push for industrialized building at national scale, and to a subsidy system, dating to 1956, that financially rewarded councils for building higher rather than more safely. Locally, it runs through Thomas North, West Ham, and then Newham's borough architect, who championed the Freemasons' Road estate and the choice of the large panel system to meet urgent local housing need. Commercially, Taylor Woodrow Anglian built the tower, and required that its own wholly owned subsidiary, Phillips Consultants, serve as the project's structural engineers, an arrangement that put no independent check between the builder and the firm certifying the builder's work. And no independent check turns out to be close to literal. The inquiry found that Phillips Consultants' design concepts and its detailed structural calculations were, in its own words, never checked or considered by any other qualified engineer. The only outside look the design got was a bylaw check by the Borough Engineers Department, a compliance formality, not a safety assessment. The inquiry made a second criticism as well, that Phillips Consultants had been at fault in putting a very young man, not yet fully qualified, on site as the resident engineer for a contract of this size and novelty. The report was careful about where it laid that. It did not criticize the young man. It criticized his employers for placing him in a position his experience and training had not yet fitted him for. Institutionally, the inquiry was also critical of the National Building Agency, the government body that had approved industrialized system designs like this one without, in the panel's words, having given serious thought to how a local failure might spread through a structure, and of the Building Research Station, the government's own research laboratory, which had already investigated joint defects on a similar site and never made those findings public before Ronan Point was built. In the collapse's immediate aftermath, officials publicly defended the building. Thomas North told reporters at the scene that the structure had stood up to the explosion surprisingly well and showed no sign of any structural weakness whatsoever, a claim the subsequent inquiry's own findings would directly contradict. Anthony Greenwood, the Minister of Housing and Local Government, commissioned the Griffiths inquiry within days, and, when it reported that October, told the House of Commons the government fully accept the findings as to the causes of the accident and would act on its recommendations. Within weeks, government circulars ordered roughly 200 similar large panel blocks over 5 stories nationwide to be assessed. Buildings unable to resist a specified explosive pressure would have their gas supply removed or be structurally strengthened. Strengthening work went ahead at Ronan Point itself. The missing corner was rebuilt, and residents moved back in. But the 1986 Demolition's discovery of newspaper-packed joints, some dated to years after that strengthening was meant to have been completed, suggests the fix was never verified any more rigorously than the original construction had been. The building stood, its problems papered over in the most literal sense, until 1984, when residents' concerns about cracking led Newham Council to bring in the architect Sam Webb to survey it. Webb's report that April found the structure still could not reliably resist the explosive, wind and fire loads the post-1968 rules required, and left the council no real choice but to evacuate. Ronan Point and 8 neighboring blocks on the same estate were demolished in 1986. The site was later rebuilt with low-rise housing. Shortly before 6:15 in the morning, May 16, 1968, a cracked nut on a gas stove, a struck match in a kitchen 200 feet above Canning Town, and a wall that was never designed to fail alone, because nothing about the building around it was designed to stop a failure from spreading once it started. The regulatory answer came fast, and it's still with us. The Fifth Amendment to the Building Regulations in 1970 introduced a requirement that has since become one of the basic tenets of structural engineering worldwide, that a building will not suffer collapse to an extent disproportionate to the cause. Engineers now call this designing for robustness, or resistance to disproportionate, sometimes progressive, collapse, making sure a structure has more than one way to carry its own weight, so that losing any single part doesn't mean losing the whole thing. That's why modern structural design specifications ask what happens if you remove one column, one wall, one connection, a question that before Ronan Point, essentially nobody outside a handful of specialists thought to ask about ordinary buildings. Ronan Point is still the case study structural engineering students are taught first. Beyond the codes, the collapse changed how Britain thought about its own tower blocks. Public confidence in high-rise system-built housing, already fragile, never really recovered. Large panel construction of this kind effectively stopped in the UK not long after, and much of what had already gone up came under decades of scrutiny, some of it, as Ronan Point's own later demolition showed, justified. Structural failure tells one collapse at a time, from the investigation records and the engineering behind them. Subscribe for the next one.